one of the things that I recognize is how both grief and growth are nonlinear. Welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Dr. Maisha, and as always, very grateful to be with you for another episode. Today, we are talking about something that I really has been on my mind. It has been on my mind for a while because I have been noticing how similar they are and how they are really two sides to the same coin, and that is grief and growth. And suffice it to say, there's a lot of grief happening today in these streets for a number of reasons. And one of the things that I recognize is how both grief and growth are nonlinear, meaning we talk about the stages of grief, the shock, the denial, the bargaining, the anger, the depression and sadness, and then the acceptance. And we talk about them like they are this sort of linear process that everyone goes through. When in actuality, it can be all over the map. It can be cyclical. It's definitely iterative, meaning it happens in iterations. And growth is very similar. And and they're very much related because oftentimes we grow inside of moving through the grief process. Oftentimes when we allow ourselves to grieve, it can spark this growth inside of us. And we have to, in a sense, grow and develop and access something different in order to move through grief in a healthy way. So they're related in that way as well. For most of you all who follow me on this podcast or who have followed me over the years in the multiple podcast radio shows and things that I do out in the world, know that I am a single mother. And many of you may not know is I actually grew up for the majority of my childhood in a single parent home. So I've shared a bit about the time that I grew up in a home as a child witness to domestic abuse and how my mom did finally escape her abuser, which is fortunate because some people don't. But for a long period of time after that, we were a single parent home. And so when I found out, and I really got to see, because I am the oldest child, I really understood in the seventh grade moving out, understood as much as a 12-year-old or 13-year-old could understand. I think I was, how old you, however you are and old in the seventh grade, right? A 12-year-old or a 13-year-old is in the seventh grade. I understood well enough to know that my mom was sacrificing to be able to provide for us, right? And I knew the struggles of what was going on. And although she tried to hide her pain, it was very evident. And so when when it first occurred to me, when it first dawned on me that was going to end up being my path, there was a lot of grief there. And it was grief of many things, grief of the life that I thought that I would have with my then partner, now co-parent, grief of feeling like I failed somehow, grief of becoming yet another statistic, grief of just so many things, right? And this is before 2020. So there came a whole nother wave of grief in 2020. But suffice it to say, there was a lot of grief present that maybe I didn't even know to acknowledge. And I'm happy to say that me and my co-parent, we're all very close with where we get to celebrate being a blended family. However, at that time, it was a painful time. What I didn't realize, though, is how that grief would resurface over the years. It's been 11 and a half years since that happened because I became a single mom very early on. But that grief surfaced, resurfaced, and resurfaced at times that I thought I had completely healed from that wound. And so this is the non linear and iterative nature of grief. Something could happen. We lose a loved one. I'll share with you that I had a younger brother who passed away when he was 16. And that was, wow, I think it was over 20 years ago now, as I'm thinking about the time. And about 13 years ago, I went on a trip to Peru with a friend of mine. And we were walking through a shop. It was a sculpture shop, an art shop, ceramics shop. And one of the things that my younger brother Christopher used to love was lighthouses. And he loved the combination of the sun moon combination, like the yin and yang of the sun and moon. And so I was walking through this gift shop or this ceramic shop, this art shop, and I saw this lighthouse. And it was like all of this grief out of what felt like nowhere rushed to me. And this had been now almost 10 years, maybe over 10 years past my brother's transition. And so I didn't know where that came from. And so one of the things that I realized today, I think may have, it may have come to me at that time was that grief can come up at any time and it can be iterative. And what we can see things and it will bring that grief up. It'll peel back a layer. So as we heal from losses of ideas, losses of what we thought was going to be our path, losses of what a life that we had dreamed of, loss of the ideal of our society, the ideal of a company, loss of people who maybe we don't even know that we relate to, like the loss of Malcolm Jamal Warner was very impactful for many people, myself included. As we moved through that, we could see certain things, we could hear certain things, we could be in certain circumstances where that another layer of gets peeled back, revealing another iteration of grief to be healed. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that because then we can be allowing for the emotions that come. Now, inside of that recognition comes the growth, right? And the growth actually is in the healing. So as we move through grief and we're healing and we're peeling back the layers, we are growing, right? Two sides of the same coin, things happening simultaneously. Me having that rush of grief in Peru when I was in that gift shop more than 10 years later, and then the allowing of that and the being able to talk about what I was feeling with my friend at the time, it gave me a new connection to my brother, like a different level of connection that I hadn't realized was there. And it gave me a different appreciation for grief itself. It allowed me to grow just in being able to talk about it because normally I was a person that didn't talk about my feelings much, right? And so that growth actually happens each iteration that peels back of grief that we allow and acknowledge. I talk a lot about this remap framework, and part of that is acknowledging and honoring the emotions that come up. And so, in the same way that we honor grief, we must honor growth. And growth is also iterative. I was talking with a friend of mine, colleague friend. We were talking about this way that sometimes we don't see growth. We can't see it until we see it, until sometimes it's made very obvious. And she was sharing with me a metaphor of about the growth of bamboo. And it's fuzzy for me, so I'm going to articulate it as best I can. But apparently, when bamboo can be very small for a long period of time as it's growing, it can be you plant the seed, maybe it's a seedling, it can be very small for an extended amount of time. And then suddenly it shoots up. They would say call it a bamboo shoot for nothing, right? It shoots up several feet in a very short period of time. And what has been happening is in that time that it has stayed small, it's been fortifying its roots. Bamboo is extremely strong and extremely resilient, right? And so during that time where it's been small, it has been fortifying its roots, it's been gaining its nutrients, it's been really expanding in the soil. And then suddenly, like a teenager, it gets a growth spurt. And so I think when we think about growth, oftentimes we're doing the work, we're maybe getting coaching, maybe reading books, maybe doing courses, maybe in support groups, working with ourselves, sitting back, reflecting, journaling, working with therapists, doing the work, the inner work that we need to do. If we're in a business, we're chopping wood and carrying water, as I like to say, right? We're doing the daily tasks, being disciplined. If you're on a health journey, maybe you are planning your meals, cooking your meals more healthily, getting more steps in, getting more movement in. And sometimes for weeks, for months, and even sometimes for years, you don't feel like you're seeing big gains, but the gains are happening, right? You're doing the work, you're doing the work. You may see little bits of growth here, or you may see 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 5 steps back. And it's like what the stock market does, right? Up and down. But at some point, when you pause and you look back a year, 3 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, you realize the amount of growth that has happened. And sometimes there's a windfall of growth. Maybe you've been doing internal work with setting boundaries, you've been doing healing work around relationships, and then you're at a family function and something comes up, maybe a conflict comes up, and you handle it in a way that you've never handled it before, with ease, with gentle boundaries, with clear communications. And you're like, who was that person that just said that? Right? Whose mouth did that come out of? And then you realize in that moment that all of the work that you've been doing amounted and sprouted up in that moment. Or maybe you're in a business and you're chopping wood and you're carrying water and you're doing all the daily tasks, and suddenly you get a windfall of clients, right? And so this is the way that growth is, it can be iterative. And in a way it can, and it's also nonlinear. We have seasonality of business, we have seasonality of growth, right? Sometimes we backslide, but it's not really a backslide. It's the way growth happens, right? Just like the way grief happens. When we are stressed, I like to say hungry, angry, lonely, tired, stressed, halts, right? Then we can default back to old patterns. It doesn't mean we haven't grown. It means that there's some structure that we haven't put in place to be able to care for ourselves so that we can access the tools of our growth. And so I think it's important to recognize grief and growth and their iterative nature and their non linear nature. They're up and down nature. They're back and forth nature, and the interconnection between the two. Because oftentimes in growth, there is a lot of grieving that's happening. Because when we're growing, sometimes not everybody is growing with us. Sometimes we have to create a little bit of distance from people that we don't want to create distance from or that we feel we shouldn't create distance from. We want people to grow with us, but we can't force people to grow with us. And that can also bring on grief as well. And so the interconnection of all of this needs to be honored, needs to be recognized. And we can feel that in our body, and we can not have to go on that journey alone, right? We can be in community of people who recognize, who are fellow healers or fellow journey people on the grief and the growth path, and we can talk about these things. I really do believe that the more we get in communication with one another and normalize emotional experience, the happiness and joy and excitement and pride of growth, and the difficulties and challenges of growth, the iterative nature, the iterations of growth, celebrating, and the challenges, even the victories inside of moving through our grief processes, the recognizing and honoring of the beauty that happens as we move through our grief process, but also the pain. We need to normalize these conversations. We need to normalize them in our homes, in our communities, in our churches, our faith organizations, and in our organizations, our actual workplaces. These conversations need to be normalized and allowed. And there is a way to do that with balance. There's a way to normalize grief and still get work done, right? There's a way to honor grief and still have boundaries around getting things, or have accountability, I should say, and have accountability for moving processes forward. We often live in such a binary world where we say, well, if I stop to grieve, then I'm never going to. That's a if then, that's a binary mindset. But we can say, you know what? I am in the space of grief. I'm grieving right now. I need to take a moment, and then I can set myself, I can maybe work a little slower, give myself a little bit more time, give myself a little bit more space because I'm working a little bit slower. And then on those moments where we feel energized, we have those bright moments, those bright spots, those energetic moments, we can get more done, right? And in terms of growth, we need to normalize acknowledging growth, because I don't know about you, but for me, as I move through the day, I just get stuff done. And I have an accountability partner that helps me to slow down and stop and acknowledge my feelings, acknowledge my growth, celebrate my successes. If without her, shout out to Dr. Nicole, your next chapter. Without her, I would probably fail to stop, right? And she's not the only one. I have many people who, who mirror back to me growth, success, qualities that I wouldn't necessarily recognize in myself as growth qualities, and people I feel safe enough to share my feelings, to share my grief with. I have those people in my life as well. Some of them are crossover people, and then there are additional as well. So, how are you normalizing these conversations? How are you normalizing these conversations? How can you normalize these conversations? I know that may be a question, like, how do I do that? How do I do that? It starts with at least in the home, just inquiring, how are we feeling? How are we feeling today? And it doesn't mean every time we ask that question, we need to go into a 30-minute, hour-long discussion about emotions. It's just to start recognizing it and start normalizing it. I feel this today. I am feeling stressed today. My brain is full today. I feel so excited today about such and such coming up, right? Both the good and the challenging. And then in the workplace, when there is something happening like reorganizations and layoffs, these are things that need to be acknowledged. I know this is hard. I know some of you may be grieving. Maybe have a group. I know there's EAP, and EAP can be great. And we can provide coaching if you need coaching as an organization. I think organizations really need to normalize providing coaching around well being, around grief, around, of course, leadership. That's normalized, but why not around other things, around expanding the capacity to uh, communicate in trauma informed ways? So that is trauma informed to say, okay, for those who have not been, we have layoffs happening, we have reorganization happening. We know people may be grieving. Here are the resources available. There are coaches available. There's a group available. We're going to have a session. I think these are things that need to be normalized. And some might say, oh, we don't have time for that. You have time for what you prioritize. You have time for what you prioritize. And I'm saying this both to individuals, but also to leaders and to organizations. And if you prioritize well-being and inviting in the conversations of grief and the conversations for growth. Like really, okay, we know that you are on a leadership track, or some of you want to be on a leadership track. And I see organizations that do this really well. They have mentorship and leadership programs and cohorts. And it's part of actually what I do with organizations. Usually they'll go through a leadership cohort, and I'm either something that is a supplement to on the back end of an early career leadership cohort, then teaching more deepened skills of trauma informed communication and building trust and safety. I love doing that. That's part of the work I do. And because it's part of the work I do, I get to see organizations that are doing that work and that are doing it well. And it needs to be done more, especially in healthcare. So, with that said, your reflection for the week is, how am I normalizing, honoring grief? How am I honoring and acknowledging and celebrating growth? And where can I see the interconnection between the two in my life, in my community, in my workplace? And so, with that, I will remind you soon and very soon you will get to see my new TEDx talk, and it's all about repair and why our saying sorry sometimes doesn't heal, right? Because sometimes we need to be looking deeper into moving from just apologizing to repair. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to be having some really fun and exciting and deep conversations that are going to be associated with this. So stay tuned for that. I'll be making those announcements very soon and posting and leaving those links for people to register in the show notes. And these will be free watch sessions, but they're not just going to be watch sessions. They're going to be inquiries on how we can move towards repair in those relationships where we might be a little resistant. It's like the one that I talked about in my talk. Share this episode. Share this episode with a friend, with a family, with a colleague. I think that understanding this relationship between grief and growth is extremely important and something that we need to make sure that we honor. And so, with that, I leave you to move forward, and reflect. And until the next time I see you, please, by the way, let me know what your thoughts are. Leave a comment, leave a review. We really appreciate reviews because, again, they let people know that the conversations we're having are valuable conversations. Share with at least one person and leave a review for us. And until the next time I see you, stay empowered.